health and human behavior. Now, long-term fans of these lectures will notice that I usually start on the very folk psychological side of things. I'll have a what is the thing that we're talking about thing first, but I'm not doing that this time because, I mean, everyone obviously understands what health is. We talked about it right at the beginning of semester in our tutorials and things like this, but the particular subset of health that we're concerned with here, I had to sort of give us a historical context on this, and that's what the previous video was about. Coming into this now, while we often associate health with psychology from a mental health perspective, talking about psychopathology, whether you have mental illnesses and things like this, we're looking at the other side of this now. The psychological aspects that control your everyday sense of health, how you manage your diet, your exercise, your engagement with things that can make you sick in the environment. That's what health psychology is. That's what we're focusing on for this lecture, and it's one of the big overlap areas that we're going to have to consider here between allied health practice and psychology. So if I were to give the definition here, I have it written up. Health psychology is the field of psychology concerned with how our patterns of thought, belief, and behavior contribute to, or undermine, if we're lucky, if we're unlucky, sorry, our bodily health and specific diseases. You know, how we manage our tendency to get sick and our tendency to operate, you know, day to day. You know, I mentioned before when we were talking about emotions and things like this, and we were talking about cognition as well, that our minds are, when you really get down to it, for all the other esoteric things we might want to say about the human mind and what the human brain does is a control system for our bodies. Its function is to guide us around through space, to do adaptive things, to survive and flourish as an organism. So a lot of our health outcomes come down to the micromanagement of how well our mind can negotiate us through space and make decisions about what we need to do to keep ourselves alive. So there's a wide range of voluntary behaviors. We refer to these as the health-affecting behaviors that have long-term, you know, impacts, often aversive impacts if we do certain things, on our health. And we can all think of what these kinds of things are. If you look in the textbook, when they talk about health-affecting behaviors or health-risking behaviors, the common examples are things like alcoholism, smoking, dietary patterns that lead to obesity, consumption of narcotics, unprotected sex, things like this. Generally things that are a ton of fun to go through at the time, but have bad long-term health consequences. That's part of the dynamic that we have to straddle here. When we're looking at health psychology, we're trying to figure out, why do people vary in the degree to which they engage with these kinds of problems? What is it about the environment that makes us vulnerable to these kinds of issues, these health-compromising issues? How can we put people in a position where they can manage their health better and overall will have better health outcomes, given the kinds of psychological mechanisms we have to manage these kinds of things? So, I mean, if I were to articulate what I would call the central puzzle of health psychology, it's this idea that, you know, back from a lot of human history, I mentioned before talking about demon possession models, humorism, vitalism, alchemy, things like this. For a lot of human history, it was a lot of guesswork. We had no idea what really did or did not make us healthy. You know, we couldn't take authorities especially seriously with regards to whether or not their advice of what to do and what not to do would really lead to robustly better or worse health for us. We don't have that problem anymore, though. Medical science has really got a lot of elements of this, especially in terms of particular organ function and things like that. You know, we've got that scientific method nailed now. We've got it down. When experts tell us things like, you know, excessive drinking, you know, excessive smoking and things like that, any smoking, in fact, you know, is bad for your health and is a long-term negative outcome for you, we can understand that they really mean it. People have looked into this. We can take this information seriously. And yet, we still do things that are bad for us. We do things that are bad for us even though we know they are. So why? That is the central issue of health psychology. What is it about these control mechanisms that allow us to manage the health-relevant aspects of our behavior that don't work especially well in these domains, that we will still do things that we know are bad for us? So again, we have the classic examples here: drinking, smoking, fatty and fried foods and things like this. You know, we still indulge in them to a great degree. And if I were to give just a single visualization as to why this is the case, the underlying message that we're pushing for here, I'll caution everyone, it's really gross, the next slide that I'm going to show you here. So if you're watching this lecture and you don't want to see anything gross, just close your eyes and I'll give you the signal when you can open them. For everyone else, brace yourselves. So I love this graphic because it's a bunch of people, you know, enjoying themselves out, you know, to dinner, the Japanese people, at a restaurant sort of setting. And if you couldn't see what we can see in this work of art, if you were just seeing, you know, their faces and their behavior as we normally do, you would think like, I feel bad for that lady on the right there. She's eating fruits and things like this, while the others are indulging in more fun things like beer and smoking and things like this. But in this image, we can see what is usually hidden for us. The lady on the right has really quite intact organs, everything's going fine for her, but the other two, we can see the things that would otherwise be invisible. The guy's lungs are in really bad shape. It's not visible to us every day, but this smoking that he enjoys doing has a hidden danger to it. It's doing hidden damage to him that you can't easily visualize. Same with the lady who's drinking a lot of beer, clearly showing, cirrhotic patterns on her liver, potentially leading towards liver failure. If we could see these things, we could factor them into our intuitive judgments, but we can't. And that's the underlying principle here. Part of the failure of our health regulation behaviors is that difference between, from a regular intuitive human perspective, what dangers and benefits in the environment can we and our senses be aware of, versus what are the things that are hidden from us that we have to kind of take on the faith of health authorities. So anyone who wasn't looking at the gross thing, you can come back now, of course. When we're talking about the most general trends in health psychology for why people do maladaptive behaviors in this sense, why they fail to manage their health behaviors very well, the two most overarching trends, before we get to the specific health models on this, that we've already touched on a little bit in some of our other psychology material, especially talking about the cognition stuff here, is we have temporal discounting. It's similar with the kids with the marshmallows and things like that. Our judgment systems in our brains are designed to weigh up costs and benefits in a way that is calibrated for our distant evolutionary history. In a way where if you're not certain you're going to get a certain outcome in the distant future, people might renege on their promises, harvests might not come in, things like this. It makes sense to get what you can now. So we have a kind of temporal myopia here. We favor things that will come soon from things that are in the distance. That's a sound logic for, investments and things like this. It's a bad logic for inevitable consequences, for things like the accruing of tar inside of your lungs or the gradual failure of your organs. So, we just don't have a good set of intuitive systems to manage these long-term expectations that are inevitable because we do temporal discounting, something that will only have its negative consequences far in the future, like, lung cancer from smoking or something like this. We're not good at factoring that into our behavior management in real time. And when we come to why we are driven towards doing certain things, we also have overshot of drives, or drive overshot as it's sometimes called. A lot of things that were scarce to our ancestors in our evolutionary context on this, we have no sense of too much on them, therefore we cannot regulate them in modern circumstances where they are abundant. A really good example of this is sweet food. We don't have a sense, in the same way that you do with savory food, as to being really full up on sweets. Sweets are so, calorie rich and things like this. You get so much energy out of sugar-rich things that you should only need to eat a very small amount of them. Rats, for example, intuitively only eat small amounts of sweet things until, they have enough energy. We don't have that, though, because for our ancestors, where sweetness only existed in fruits and things like this, there was no such thing as too much to eat. So if we're now in the modern world that we encounter really overabundant sweetness and refined sugars and candies and cakes and things like this, we do not have an intuitively good too much level. We generally eat way too many sweets and things like this, and therefore overload our blood sugar and things like this. We don't have an intrinsic management system for it. It's like that with a few of our drives where, in our evolutionary history, the environment would put a lid on how much of it we could do, so we don't have an internal regulatory mechanism for it. We can't tell when it's too much of a good thing. It's an overall trend in that sense, that our modern environments are governed by choice and preference a lot more than they were in traditional societies in our distant evolutionary past. It didn't matter a lot back in the day if people had huge interpersonal variation in terms of how much they wanted sweet things, how much they wanted to sleep in, things like that, because circumstances would dictate, if you want to eat today, you have to get up and go foraging. You could only forage as much food as was available in the terrain at the time. These are natural limits that you would place on these things. A good example of this is the sense of satiety in human beings. We vary quite a lot, individual to individual, on how quickly we feel full when we are stuffing our stomachs. Now, that just didn't matter once upon a time, because the main thing that governed how much food you would eat isn't, satiety. It would be just how much food is available. It was only under rare circumstances of plenty that human beings would have to say, I'm going to voluntarily stop eating now, because, you know, I've had enough food to eat. So it didn't really matter that people have vastly different levels of satiety on this, that some of us, you know, get full really quickly and therefore don't put on a lot of weight when eating calorie-rich food, whereas other people get full very slowly, and eating just doing the exact same behavior regulation, eating until you stop being hungry, is now devastatingly bad for your health. It's an individual difference. Another quick example on this that I can give is variability in attention. You know, you'll sometimes hear people talking about, you know, the overdiagnosis of ADHD in the modern world and things like this, how the diagnosis keeps going up and up and up over time. That is less so a problem of, you know, oh, what are we doing? And we got lead in the water that's poisoning kids' minds or something like this. No, the main thing is that the social standard of how much attention you need to be able to pay is always rising. We get more competitive in schools. We get more competitive in, you know, sedentary job markets and offices and things like this, or in universities. As such, the pre-existing natural variation in how much people could pay attention to boring things is still there in the population. It's only being wheedled out very, very gradually on a genetic and evolutionary level. Therefore, you know, when we keep every decade or so moving the benchmarks into how much attention people need to pay to boring things to get by in school or in jobs or things like this particular aspect of working memory, we're creating a larger and larger underclass of people in that sense, who just because of natural variation in how much attention they are comfortable paying, they are now at a disadvantage based on these societal standards. So, you know, you get the sort of idea there. That's the underlying idea. It's an important thing to wrap your head around as we move forward on this, is that we use these internal regulatory mechanisms, our internal intuitions, to manage our health behavior based on the expectations of the environment around us. And many of the expectations about modern society, a lot of the things that a reasonable adult is expected to be able to do, resist the temptations of advertising, plan your budget well in advance so that you don't go broke, walk away from fights instead of engaging with them, a lot of these sorts of things can be significantly harder or easier for some people based on natural variations that once upon a time didn't amount to much of anything, but nowadays can put you at a severe disadvantage despite the fact that our expectations are one size fit all. We tend to blame people for things they can't control in this regard. So this is one of the reasons why the health regulation theories that we're going to talk about, the health psychology theories, put such a big emphasis on self-efficacy, because, you know, we focus on outreach, we focus on interventions to be good health psychologists, to be good health professionals. What you're largely looking for is what kinds of interventions, what kind of restructurings of the environment can you introduce that will give people who are at, just for personal reasons, an inherent disadvantage in certain regulatory behaviors, will make life easier for them in order to not make maladaptive decisions in their own life, while at the same time not putting undue restraints on people for whom this kind of self-regulation is effortless. A really quick example of that would be in the United States of America, in New York, there was a legal ordinance passed that you couldn't have really big tubs of soda. Now, a lot of people thought, well, that's Orwellian. Why won't you let me buy as much soda as I want? I can decide how much soda I want. It's a personal decision, etc. Of course, for some people it is. For some people, yeah, you quickly get tired of drinking something fizzy and sugary, therefore you won't drink so much of it that you'll give yourself diabetes. But there is natural variation in the population. There are enough people, that at least the lawmakers in New York justified, there are enough people in the population who, given an absolutely free choice on the matter, just will fail to regulate successfully and inadvertently make themselves sick if enormous tubs of soda are an option. So it's safer for the population at whole, from a health perspective, to just limit the maximum size of these servings. But anyway, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the specific health models of health psychology. I'll see you there.